The narrative, intended to unveil the origins of one of antiquity's most monumental conflicts, begins not with the thunder of battles or the blaze of ruined fleets, but with a seemingly innocuous object, a golden apple. This shimmering fruit, swiftly tossed amidst a grand celebration, instantly carved its path into the annals of mythical history. Before the audience unfolds an era where divine beings walk alongside mortals, where rulers are bound by unbreakable oaths, and a single decision can irreversibly alter the course of a decade-long struggle. This is not yet the Hellas revered for its refined temples and profound philosophers. This is a far more ancient and enigmatic mythical age, when colossal heroes cast truly gigantic shadows, and the gods still actively intervened in every aspect of human existence. Viewers are invited to delve into the depths of millennia past. Let the past unfold unhurriedly, for the narrative commences at that pivotal moment when the seed of the Trojan War was cast into the soil of history. The initial act unfolds not amidst bloody battles, but against the backdrop of a truly opulent and grandiose celebration. This was a divine wedding of such magnitude that it demanded nothing less than golden goblets, celestial harpists, and a feast of such splendor that mortals were undoubtedly forbidden entry. The setting chosen was a space stretching between the azure heavens and the mysterious wine-dark sea. It was the marriage of Peleus, an earthly king, and Thetis, a sea nymph whose beauty was unparalleled and whose temperament was utterly unpredictable. Today her touch could calm raging waves. Tomorrow she might transform into a fiery lioness. Beings like sea nymphs were, indeed, elusive and changeable in all their manifestations. This celebration transcended an ordinary wedding. The Olympian gods themselves were present. Mighty Zeus, imperious Hera, wise Athena, radiant Apollo, and even Dionysus, who, beyond a doubt, came for the exquisite wines and the inevitable drama. The reason for such an unusual union was an ancient prophecy stating that a descendant of Thetis would one day surpass his father. Naturally, the gods, those celestial equivalents of ambitious, power-hungry officials, unanimously decided that none of them wished to raise a demigod capable of challenging their throne in the future. Therefore, they married her to a mortal. This lucky individual was Peleus, a highly respected warrior who, by all accounts, was wise enough not to ask too many questions. It was at this moment that the narrative of the lavish celebration began to rapidly transform into a harbinger of imminent catastrophe. The truth was, one very significant person had not been invited to this grand wedding. This person was Eris, the goddess of discord, strife, and all things inconvenient. She could be envisioned as the divine embodiment of an exceedingly ill-timed and destructive message. Deeply offended and seething with righteous indignation, Eris did what anyone in her position likely would. She arrived uninvited and presented her unique gift, a gleaming, flawlessly beautiful golden apple, on whose surface was skillfully engraved 3 concise words, "To the fairest." With accuracy befitting a goddess, she hurled it into the center of the banqueting hall, watching as absolute silence instantly descended, and, in all likelihood, departed with a triumphant smirk. One might naively assume that the gods stood above petty squabbles over a shiny fruit. Yet, alas, divine dignity abandoned the feasting hall more swiftly than Hermes himself in the midst of market bustle. 3 great goddesses immediately laid claim to the golden apple. Hera, the majestic queen of Olympus. Athena, the embodiment of wisdom and war strategy. and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and all that complicates mortal and immortal existence. Each sincerely believed herself to be the sole rightful owner, and each, in her own way, possessed enough formidable power and influence to make the others question their superiority. Faced with this unprecedented celestial beauty contest, the Olympians acted as earthly bureaucrats often do when confronted with an impasse. They shifted the burden of decision onto someone else's shoulders. Enter Paris, Prince of Troy, whose subsequent choices would eloquently demonstrate that prudence was not his strong suit. However, at that fateful moment, he was merely a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. Having been secretly removed from the royal court in early childhood due to an ominous prophecy that he would one day cause Troy's downfall, his family, quite naturally, decided to get rid of him, just in case. Nevertheless, he grew into a young man of extraordinary beauty and robust health, and more importantly, utterly unprepared to judge a divine dispute. The three goddesses appeared before Paris, and, it should be noted, not in the humble guise of mortals, but in full, dazzling divine splendor. Each offered him her unique bribe. Hera promised him boundless power, dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom surpassing human comprehension and invincibility in any battle. But Aphrodite, always keenly attuned to her audience, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, reasoning like a passionate youth, rather than a far-sighted geopolitical strategist, unhesitatingly gave the golden apple to Aphrodite, and from that moment, the world began its inexorable descent into flames. But who was this incomparable woman, whose beauty was considered the greatest in the world? Her name was Helen, Queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda, or, according to some traditions, Nemesis, depending on which of the numerous versions of the myth one prefers. Many powerful Greek rulers vied for her hand and heart, and their passions once nearly led to widespread civil strife. Seeking to prevent inevitable conflict, her mortal father, King Tyndareus, compelled all suitors to swear a solemn oath. They would respect Helen's choice, and if anyone ever dared to abduct her, they would unite their forces to retrieve her. This was an early, but highly indicative, example of what would later become a true foreign policy nightmare, merely awaiting its hour. Ultimately, Helen favoured Menelaus, a very capable, if somewhat arrogant, king of Sparta. They married, and, for a time, their lives proceeded in relative peace. This continued until Paris arrived at Menelaus's court, under the guise of a diplomatic mission, and then, with Aphrodite's active support, either seduced or abducted Helen. Here the ancient sources diverge. In Homer's epic Iliad, Helen appears weary, full of regrets, and a passive victim of circumstances. In Euripides' tragedy, her portrayal is more assertive and active. Later poets go even further, claiming that Helen never set foot on Trojan soil, but only her phantom, ghostly copy, while the true queen remained in Egypt, like a slightly annoyed chess piece awaiting her turn. Regardless of the chosen version, the outcome was unchanged. Paris returned to Troy with Helen, and Menelaus, consumed by furious rage, immediately summoned every king, prince, and warrior who had ever sworn to defend Sparta's honor. It is at this dramatic moment that myth begins to intersect with historical reality. For centuries, scholars have fiercely debated whether the Trojan War actually took place. Was there a genuine conflict between the mighty Mycenaean Greeks and a prosperous city on the Anatolian coast? Perhaps this city was Wilusa, whose name strikingly resembles Ilion, another name for Troy. Archaeological excavations at Hisarlik, the generally accepted site of Troy, indicate the existence of a city that was destroyed by fire and war, not once, but many times. Through this strategically important region passed bustling trade routes, along which untold riches flowed. Conflicts were undoubtedly an integral part of such a turbulent history. Thus, while the gods may not have hurled lightning bolts from Olympus, someone certainly threw something else over those ancient walls. Returning to the mythological thread of the narrative, it should be noted that Greek forces began to gather universally. Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae and Menelaus's brother, assumed supreme command of the united forces. Not that he was universally beloved, far from it, but his undeniable advantage lay in possessing a numerous fleet, a vast arsenal, and a very impressive voice capable of silencing any objections. Other prominent rulers answered his call: Odysseus, famed for his cunning and resourcefulness; Nestor, a wise but very talkative elder; Ajax, the embodiment of unbreakable strength and taciturnity; and of course the most famous of all, Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the very couple whose marriage sparked this entire grand chaos. Achilles was the prince of the Myrmidons, raised, according to ancient legends, by the wise centaur Chiron, and trained to become the greatest warrior of his century. His mother, Thetis, seized by fear that her son would perish at a young age, immersed him in the sacred waters of the river Styx to grant him invulnerability everywhere, except for one single spot: the heel by which she held him. This myth, of course, gave humanity the enduring expression Achilles' heel, and serves as an eternal reminder that even the mightiest heroes possess their vulnerable points, sometimes quite literally. However, not all heroes were equally eager to immediately join the coming war. Odysseus, famed for his sophisticated mind and eternal tactical acumen, feigned madness to avoid separation from his young son. He yoked an ox and a donkey to a plough, then began sowing his fertile fields with salt, mimicking insanity. This charade continued until one astute Greek placed his infant directly in front of the moving plough. Odysseus, without hesitation, swerved, thereby irrefutably proving his sanity, and consequently was immediately sent to war. Achilles was also carefully hidden, disguised in maiden's clothing among the daughters of King Lycomedes. This cunning plan worked successfully until the same Odysseus arrived on the island, bringing with him trinkets and weapons, which he laid out before the assembled maidens. Achilles, following his true calling, immediately reached for a sword, revealing himself. Thus the greatest heroes were gathered. Ships, numbering up to 1,000, as ancient legend claims, were ready to set sail, and the winds, it seemed, awaited them. Or did they not? In the port of Aulis the entire fleet lay becalmed. The gods, it turned out, were not so frivolous and amenable to manipulation. Artemis, the stern goddess of the hunt, was deeply offended, presumably by Agamemnon, who had either boasted of his hunting prowess or, even worse, killed a sacred deer. In retaliation, she demanded a terrifying price: the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, young Iphigenia. This was one of those dramatic moments when Greek myth takes a sharp turn from lavish splendor to bottomless tragedy. Agamemnon quite naturally hesitated. His torment was entirely understandable. but ultimately all-consuming ambition triumphed over paternal love. Iphigenia was lured to Aulis under the false pretext of marriage to the great Achilles, and there she was sacrificed. Some versions of the myth offer a more merciful ending. Artemis carried her away at the last moment, leaving a deer on the altar, but most traditions explicitly state Agamemnon coldly killed his daughter, and only then did the long-awaited winds begin to blow. This was truly a dark omen, and an equally dark beginning for the war to come. And so, under the weight of seething divine grudges, burdened by oaths called to fulfillment and escalating personal tragedies, 1,000 ships set sail for the shores of Troy, unaware that they would spend 10 years there, paying the price for human pride and thirst for revenge. And even less could they know that by the time it all ended, the vast majority of them would either perish, be disgraced, or be doomed to eternal wandering. However, the further development of these events will be the subject of the next narrative. For now, it remains only to reflect that even the most grandiose war in mythology began not with the clang of swords, but with a lavish wedding, a deep insult, and a single apple of discord. Now, leaving behind the divine chaos of golden fruits and quarrelling goddesses, attention shifts to the woman who, some believe, caused 1,000 ships to set sail. Perhaps this is a slight poetic exaggeration, for ancient bards were never excessively restrained in their expressions. However, it is fair to acknowledge that Helen of Sparta, and then of Troy, was at the very epicenter of this looming storm. Helen's story unfolds even before her birth, which in itself foreshadows the coming upheavals. Her mother, Leda, occupied the throne of the Queen of Sparta. One afternoon, Zeus, the restless and impetuous among the Olympians, spied her from the heavens and, as was often the case, desired to win her favor. However, instead of appearing in his true form, divine, resplendent, sometimes with lightning in hand, he chose the guise of a swan, for of course, that is precisely what he did. The result of this extraordinary union, depending on the mythological version, was either one egg or several. Yes, Leda laid eggs. Mythological narrative, as is known, gladly embraces the whimsical and cares little for the plausible. From these eggs emerged Helen, and sometimes also her brothers Castor and Pollux, and her sister Clytemnestra, who would later play a very significant role when things began to fall apart across Greece. But for now, Helen grew up in royal splendor. From the very beginning, she was a marvelous creature. Not merely beautiful, her beauty, as we are told, was otherworldly, godlike, such that it elicited admiring sighs from men, became the subject of envious gossip among women, and prompted kings to quite improper behavior. When Helen reached maturity, almost every worthy man in the Hellenic world sought her hand and heart. Among her suitors were the bravest warriors, princes and rulers, including Odysseus, Ajax and Menelaus. Their numbers were so vast that her mortal father, Tyndareus, was justifiably worried. No matter whom he chose, the others would almost certainly harbour resentment, ignite bloody feuds, and likely this would be accompanied by destruction in their wake. Therefore, on the advice of Odysseus, a shrewd and far-sighted sage, Tyndareus compelled the contenders for her hand to swear an unbreakable oath, known as the Oath of Tyndareus. All of them agreed to humbly accept Helen's choice, and more importantly, to stand in defense of her chosen husband, if anyone ever tried to take her from him. A wise decision which, as often happens with such decisions in Greek myths, was destined to spectacularly backfire into disaster. Helen favored Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother and the future ruler of Sparta. Menelaus was capable, wealthy, universally respected, lacking particular charm, but nevertheless possessing an imposing presence. He was the type of man who personally ensured his armor was polished and expected it to be noticed. Helen and Menelaus married, and for a time their union prospered. They had a daughter, Hermione, settled into the Spartan palace, and governed their orderly state peacefully and wisely. And then Paris arrived. Paris, son of Priam and Hecuba of Troy, was raised not as a prince, but as an unassuming shepherd. This is a common trope in myths, where someone's birth is accompanied by an ominous prophecy. In Paris's case, the prophecy was very specific and grim. He would cause the downfall of Troy. So, naturally, his parents did what any responsible monarch would do. They abandoned him to fend for himself in the wilderness. Unfortunately, Paris survived. Raised among shepherds, he grew into a man of dazzling appearance, but with considerable short-sightedness. Eventually he was readmitted to the royal family, the prophecy likely forgotten in the whirlwind of events. Soon after, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Greece, officially to foster good neighbourly relations, unofficially to stir up strife. When Paris arrived in Sparta, Menelaus welcomed him warmly, being a hospitable host by Greek standards, which usually meant offering food, wine, and refraining from harming the guest. But then Menelaus was forced to depart for a funeral ceremony. Paris, always a cunning opportunist and under the powerful influence of Aphrodite, who had promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, did not fail to exploit the ruler's absence. Whether Helen was a willing accomplice or a victim of all-powerful divine intervention is one of the deepest ambiguities of ancient myth. Homer's Iliad portrays her as conflicted, ashamed, deep in thought, but without obvious compulsion. Later tragedians, such as Euripides, endow her with a greater degree of free will, or, conversely, a complete lack thereof, depending on the narrative's tone. Some versions, like Euripides' Helen, go so far as to claim she was never in Troy, that Paris stole only a ghostly semblance, while the real Helen remained in Egypt, as bewildered as everyone else. But the popular version holds that Helen departed with Paris, crossing the Aegean Sea to Troy, leaving behind her husband, child, and more importantly, the oath that bound all her former suitors. When Menelaus returned and discovered his wife gone, his honour publicly trampled, he did not sink into silent grief. He invoked the sacred oath. Messengers were dispatched across Greece, rulers summoned. Former alliances were revitalized. Even those who had long retired were now bound by an unbreakable vow. And what a magnificent gathering of valiant men it was. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, led the combined army. He was ambitious, proud, and did not hesitate to sacrifice his daughter when the wind refused to blow. But that story has already been mentioned. Odysseus sought to evade participation in the campaign. He had a young son, a clever wife, and felt no desire for overseas adventures, so he feigned madness, sowing his fields with salt. But when Greek agents placed his infant Telemachus before the plough, Odysseus swerved, thereby confirming his sanity and sealing his fate. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, also showed no eagerness to join the fray. His mother, Thetis, hid him on the island of Scyros, dressing him in maiden's clothes among the daughters of King Lycomedes. Why? Because it was foretold that if Achilles went to war, he would not return. But again, Odysseus devised a cunning plan. He laid out gifts for the maidens, combs, bracelets, mirrors, and one dazzlingly shining sword. Achilles chose the martial equipment, predictable but effective. In time, a countless host assembled. The ships were ready. Legend says the fleet consisted of 1,000 vessels, and the mightiest army the Greek world had ever known gathered under Agamemnon's banner. However, before they sailed, they needed a favorable omen. You see, the Greeks attached immense importance to omens. The gods did not send written messages, but revealed their portents through birds. In Aulis, a snake appeared, devouring 9 sparrows, and then turned to stone. The seer Calchas proclaimed that this meant the war would last 9 years, and Troy would fall on the 10th. One can imagine that morale somewhat faltered. Nevertheless, the Greeks embarked on their military campaign. But they did not immediately discover Troy. First, they mistakenly attacked Mysia, a city which, by an annoying coincidence, was quite similar to Troy. Geography, it turned out, left much to be desired among the Greeks. Eventually, they reached Troy and encamped along the shores outside the city's impregnable walls. These walls, according to myth, were built by Apollo and Poseidon, who had taken on mortal forms when they were temporarily punished and forced to serve King Laomedon. So they were, to say the least, unshakable. This was not promising to be a swift war. Inside Troy, Helen was greeted not as a captive, but as a full-fledged queen. Priam, the venerable monarch, showed her favour. His son Hector, the city's bravest defender, was courteous, though he harboured a certain disapproval. The city, for all its grandeur, became a gilded cage for her. Helen was now the embodiment of a conflict over which she had almost no power, equally praised and blamed. Meanwhile, the war transitioned into a prolonged and exhausting struggle. Raids, skirmishes, and diplomatic missions followed. Heroes rose and fell, and throughout all this, Helen remained at the centre, not participating in the battles but remaining a silent witness. Her story is the embodiment of paradox. She is simultaneously a victim of circumstances and an active participant in events, adored and despised, entering history not by her deeds, but by her very presence. Her role as a trophy for which the greatest warriors shed blood and met their end. And what about Helen herself? Well, myths offer no unambiguous solutions. Some say she fell passionately in love with Paris, then hated him. Some say she pitied Menelaus, then despised him. In one version, with the fall of Troy, she returns to Sparta to her husband, who grants her forgiveness. In another, she was strangled by Menelaus' mother in a fit of righteous rage. Poets never managed to agree on what to do with her. She was too beautiful to be malicious, and too dangerous to be virtuous. She was, perhaps, the personification of war itself, not rational, not just, but absolutely inevitable. And thus, with Helen in Troy, Menelaus in a fury, and every king of Greece clamouring for revenge, the stage was fully set. The war hadn't truly begun, but the fuse was lit. The walls of Troy still stood impregnable, but every god, every mortal, and every poet knew they would not stand forever. In the next chapter, we will meet all the characters of the heroic epic and begin the description of the siege itself. a conflict driven by pride, filled with prophecies, and permeated by a tragedy that would define not only the mythological narrative, but the very identity of the ancient Greek world. For now, let the reader rest in anticipation of events. The storm is brewing, but there is still time before the swords begin their deadly dance. It's extraordinary to consider the preparation for a war that hasn't yet begun. Swords are not yet drawn, ships have not yet sailed the seas, but the decisions made in these moments, silent yet unyielding, echo as powerfully as the impending battle cries. And here we are again in Greece, where alliances are once more called to action, oaths are revived with ostentatious solemnity, and kings emerge from the shadows of their own ambitions. The Greeks, or more accurately the Achaeans, were not a unified people, but a loose confederation of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own ruler, customs, dialects, and an annoying sense of superiority. Gathering them together was like trying to herd recalcitrant cats, large, bronze-clad, and full of arrogance. Yet somehow Agamemnon took on the burden of this attempt. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was not universally loved. He possessed the charm of a raw stone and the diplomatic finesse of a battering ram, but he had ships. And in Bronze Age Greece, that was crucial. He was also Menelaus's brother, whose wife Helen had either willingly fled with the Trojan prince or been abducted, depending on whom you asked. In any case, Agamemnon felt it his duty to assist and, incidentally, to consolidate his own influence. Before the fleet ventured on its sea journey, it is necessary to introduce the main characters of this grand conflict. These are prominent individuals whose names echoed across battlefields and were immortalized in epic poems. Among them stood out Odysseus, the shrewd ruler of Ithaca, known for his sharp mind, penchant for sarcasm, and sometimes excessive cunning. His soul inclined more toward peaceful agriculture than bloody battles. When the call to arms sounded, Odysseus attempted to evade military duty by skillfully feigning madness. He unusually yoked a donkey and an ox together, then proceeded to sow his fields with salt. However, to his misfortune, among the Greeks was Palamedes, a man whose sagacity surpassed even Odysseus's. Palamedes, sensing the deception, placed the infant Telemachus, Odysseus's son, directly in front of the plough. Without hesitation, Odysseus swerved, thereby betraying his sound judgment. Thus he was forced to go to war, consumed by deep resentment. Next comes Achilles, the valiant son of the mortal king Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, known for her dramatic and sometimes unpredictable disappearances. Achilles was raised by the wise centaur Chiron, who taught him not only the fundamentals of medicine, the art of music and hunting, but also, and no less importantly, the elegant and deadly art of combat. Thetis in turn received an ominous prophecy. Her son was destined either to live a long and obscure life, forgotten by all, or to die young but achieve eternal glory, and be remembered through the ages. Understandably, the mother preferred the former option. In an attempt to alter fate, she hid Achilles on the island of Scyros, disguising him in maiden's attire. It remains unclear how convincingly he portrayed a girl, but he lived among the daughters of King Lycomedes, perhaps hoping that history would simply bypass him. However, history, as is known, never forgets figures like Achilles. It was Odysseus who was sent to find him. Knowing that no true warrior could resist the alluring call of glory or the clang of bronze weapons, he laid out various gifts before the girls, elegant garments, trinkets, and, in the centre of it all, one shining sword. As expected, Achilles instinctively reached for the sword. At that moment, a trumpet sounded, and the masquerade collapsed. Achilles, his true nature revealed, was offered honour, war spoils, and immortal glory. He consented, taking with him his loyal companion Patroclus, whose role in the coming war proved as significant as any sword or shield. To this assembly joined other distinguished figures. Among them was Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, a colossal, mighty warrior whose strength was comparable to a bull's, and whose manner of speech was equally straightforward and laconic. Then Diomedes, the young king of Argos, famed for his indomitable ferocity in battle and remarkable reverence for the gods. Nestor, the venerable king of Pylos, whose speech consisted primarily of lengthy narratives about bygone times when everything, in his opinion, was incomparably better, and who somehow always found listeners. And finally, Calchas, the seer, who claimed to comprehend divine will by interpreting the flight of birds, examining the livers of sacrificial animals, and, as one can reasonably surmise, skillfully employing the subtle art of educated guesswork. All these heroes, along with their troops, ships, and necessary provisions, gathered in the port of Aulis, a windy harbour located on the eastern coast of Boeotia. It was here, according to ancient traditions, that the entire Greek fleet was concentrated, numbering 1,000 ships, if Homer's epic lines are to be believed. This number, of course, sounds beautiful and symbolic, yet from a practical standpoint it is highly unrealistic. But, as is known, myths were never based on strict practicality. However, after the grand assembly, an ominous pause ensued. The ships were fully prepared to set sail, and the men languished in anticipation, but the gods remained utterly silent. Not a single breeze stirred the sails, and the sea surface was motionless, like the frozen expression of a thoughtful philosopher. This pervasive silence was perceived as undeniable divine retribution, and, as it soon turned out, so it was. The fact was, Agamemnon had made a fatal mistake. During a hunt, he thoughtlessly killed a sacred deer, an animal particularly dear to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and patroness of virgins, who, incidentally, was not known for her meekness in response to insults. Moreover, it was claimed that he boastfully proclaimed his superiority as a hunter, which in a mythological context was equivalent to poking a sleeping bear with a borrowed spear. As a result, Artemis refused to grant favourable winds. The fleet would remain trapped in Aulis until Agamemnon atoned for his guilt, and by atonement she meant the sacrifice of his own daughter, Iphigenia. This demand, of course, provoked universal disapproval and profound shock. Agamemnon agonizingly hesitated, shed tears, argued, and appealed to the gods. But ultimately, for the sake of war, for honour, for revenge, and all other hackneyed truths, he gave his consent. He sent word to his wife Clytemnestra that their daughter was to marry Achilles, a lie that, undoubtedly, proved fatal. Iphigenia arrived, full of joyful anticipation, perhaps even blushing slightly, and was led to the altar. Some traditions claim she was killed, others tell that Artemis, in a rare display of mercy, carried her away at the last moment, replacing the sacrifice with a deer. But most traditions explicitly state Agamemnon coldly killed his daughter, and only then did the long-awaited winds begin to blow. However, their first stop was not Troy at all. In one of those awkward historical errors that are often overlooked, they mistakenly landed in Mysia, a city in Messenia, confusing it for Troy. This further underscores that ancient navigation was more an intuitive art than an exact science. They immediately attacked. The local ruler, Telephus, was wounded by Achilles and forced to flee. Later, in an elegant twist of irony, he was healed by the very same spear of Achilles that had pierced him. The Greeks, thus, demonstrated the ability to be both destructive and benevolent, sometimes in the same instant. Finally, the fleet reached the shores of Troy, the renowned city located on the western coast of modern Turkey. From their impregnable walls, the Trojans watched as the horizon gradually filled with ominous black sails and hastily prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Here it is fitting to pause briefly to consider what the legendary city of Troy might have been like. The archaeological site, now known as Hisarlik, in northwestern Turkey, layer by layer reveals the remains of numerous settlements that were built and destroyed over centuries. One of these cultural layers, identified as Troy VI, or 7, shows clear signs of a massive fire, war, and sudden destruction. Powerful defensive walls have been uncovered, fragments of pottery intended for storing provisions, and evidence of vibrant trade with the Mycenaean world. Whether this was the very Troy sung by Homer, we will never know with absolute certainty, but its echoes are undoubtedly present in these ruins. The Trojans, in turn, also had their valiant heroes. Priam, the aged king, wise but already weary with the burden of rule, commanded from his citadel. His wife, Queen Hecuba, maintained a strict and united court. Their sons were numerous, but the most renowned was Hector, the unwavering defender of Troy, a prince, loving husband and father, a man who fought not for personal glory, but out of a deep sense of duty. Beside him stood Aeneas, a noble warrior, said to be the son of Aphrodite herself, a lineage that, as Virgil later claimed, would one day lead to the founding of great Rome. And of course there was Paris, the younger son, less noble, but far more complex in his nature. His abducted bride, Helen, was now in the palace, either as an honoured guest or a captive. Her presence was a source of both pride and deep tension. Some saw her as a rightful queen, while others considered her the primary cause of the impending catastrophe. And so, as the Greek ships landed and the beach was fortified, both sides prepared for a war, unaware that it was destined to last a full 10 years, that it would claim the lives of almost all the heroes present, and that it would forever transform the face of all mythology. Such was, however, the very nature of war in the ancient world. It rarely began with thunderous battle cries heralding an immediate clash, but rather germinated in barely audible whispers, in broken oaths, in divine grudges, and the slow, relentless gathering of dark storm clouds on the horizon. The Greek forces were assembled. Finally, the winds shifted. The gods observed the unfolding events from the heavens, and somewhere behind the unseen curtains of the universe, fate itself, that ancient and tireless weaver, was already beginning to spin its intricate, inevitable web. By this point, the legendary 1,000 ships had already crossed the vast, wine-dark sea and cast anchor off the shores of a city destined to forever enter the annals of history and mythology. Troy, which the Hellenes called Ilion, majestically rose on the edge of the Hellespont, that sparkling crossroads connecting east and west. For modern people, the name Troy might sound like something purely mythical, a place where only poetry, gods, and endless battles reside. However, beneath layers of historical accretion lies a very real city. Archaeological research suggests its ruins are at Hisarlik, in northwestern Anatolia. Here a great city with impressive walls once rose and fell repeatedly. Its remains lie in layers, like the pages of a long, tragic novel. Some of these layers bear the imprints of fires, others, traces of arrowheads, still others, clay tablets testifying to developed trade, diplomacy, and military conflicts. This was the very place where myth and harsh reality merged, and now the Greeks had come to stake their claim. Having disembarked, the Hellenes immediately began to establish their camp. This was not a temporary outpost for fleeting skirmishes, but a carefully planned and long-term coastal operation. Imagine not so much a swift assault as a substantial tent city, imbued with unwavering determination. The warriors dragged their ships onto the coastal sand, erected a sturdy palisade, and dug a deep trench. They even organized separate zones for rest, cooking, and, quite tellingly, for future victory celebrations. Achilles with his brave Myrmidons occupied the southern flank, while Ajax and the warriors from Salamis stood guard in the north. Odysseus, as expected from his astute mind, devised a clever supply system. Despite the Greeks' diverse temperaments, they were, at least for the moment, united in their primary goal. Troy, for its part, remained calm and did not succumb to panic. The city was reliably protected by colossal walls, whose construction, according to tradition, was attributed to the gods themselves, Apollo and Poseidon. These divine builders, as myth recounts, were temporarily punished by Zeus and forced to serve Troy's king Laomedon. They erected fortifications so strong and high that no mortal force could breach them, at least not by brute strength alone. And behind these walls lived the Trojans, who were not villains at all, as Greek propaganda might later portray them. King Priam, already advanced in years, ruled with astonishing dignity despite the circumstances. His court was full of numerous sons, daughters, and wise advisers. His wife, Hecuba, was a perceptive and formidable woman, and frankly possessed more foresight than most of the warriors beyond the city gates. The jewel of the Trojan defence, its brightest symbol, was Hector, Priam, and Hecuba's firstborn. He was not a demigod, possessed no semi-immortal power of a wild creature. He was merely a man, but a man of unyielding loyalty, skilled in combat and noble in his restraint. He fought not for personal glory, but for his city, for his family, and for his young son Astyanax, who innocently ran through the palace halls, unaware of the deadly fate history had already inscribed for his future. And of course there was Paris, the younger son, less noble but far more complex in his nature. Paris, as you may already know, received Helen as a gift from the gods. He was handsome, charming, but utterly unprepared for the destructive consequences his decisions entailed. In Homer's Iliad, Paris is depicted not as evil or cruel, but rather as agonizingly aware of his unsuitability for glory on the battlefield. He is the man who sparked a war with a kiss, and then spent much of the conflict trying to evade its inevitable consequences. Regarding Helen, her dwelling now served as the upper chambers of the majestic palace. Opinions regarding her person among the Trojans varied significantly. Some inhabitants of Troy extolled her otherworldly grace, her sophistication, her practically supernatural beauty, seeing in her the embodiment of an ideal. Others, more pragmatic and less susceptible to her charms, unequivocally laid responsibility for the outbreak of war at her feet. One can confidently assume that she overheard these whispers, as evidenced by lines in the Iliad. She appears before us as a figure possessing both keen self-awareness and deep self-loathing. "I wish I had died before following your son here," she bitterly tells Priam. And yet she remains, and the war has already begun. Its commencement was marked not by the fall of majestic towers, but by a series of merciless raids. The Greeks, faced with the insurmountable walls of Troy, were forced to resort to attacking Trojan allies, devastating cities along the coast. They ruthlessly seized supplies, enslaved women, and set fire to everything they couldn't carry away. This cyclical pattern, campaign, subsequent retreat, brief rest, defined the character of military operations throughout the first 9 years of the conflict. During one such devastating raid, Greek warriors captured 2 women, whose names would later become the catalyst for a grand catastrophe. One was Chryseis, daughter of Apollo's Trojan priest, who fell to Agamemnon. The other, Briseis, was awarded to Achilles. These women were not merely spoils of war in the usual sense of trophies. They were grimly taken as concubines. And, as it turned out, the gods were watching intently. When Chryseis' father, filled with despair, pleaded for her return, and Agamemnon arrogantly refused, Apollo, patron of plague, master archer, and sometimes dispenser of poetic justice, unleashed a terrible plague upon the Greek camp. Soldiers began to die en masse, animals fell dead, and the air filled with the stench of decomposition. Ultimately, Agamemnon yielded, though not without a furious outburst. He returned Chryseis to her father, it is true, but as compensation he demanded Briseis from Achilles. This, to put it mildly, was a fatal mistake. Achilles, whose pride was already smouldering from past grievances, demonstratively withdrew from the war. He refused to fight, refused to speak, and even avoided direct eye contact with Agamemnon, only occasionally casting a scorching glance his way. The mightiest Greek warrior had now retreated, in a state some called sulky stubbornness, but in reality he was deeply wounded. In the heroic code of that era, honor was valued far above any armor. To be publicly disgraced meant not just an insult, but the destruction of one's very soul. The morale of the Greek troops noticeably faltered. They continued their assaults on the city, yet without Achilles' participation, they found themselves in an extremely difficult position. Their momentum weakened. Hector, on the other hand, feeling a surge of strength, decisively lunged forward, skillfully rallying the Trojan forces and vigorously driving the Greeks back to their very ships. Fierce clashes erupted on the battlefields. War chariots thundered, shields splintered with a crash, but the impregnable walls of Troy still stood unyielding. However, let us momentarily digress from the course of battle and delve into understanding what this war truly looked like. Not in exalted poetry, but in the harsh realities of the Bronze Age. This was by no means trench warfare, not a confrontation of mass armies of uniformed soldiers as we know them from later eras. These were battles dominated by chariots, short swords, and throwing spears. The metal from which weapons and armor were made was bronze, not iron. Armor was massive, heavy, and individually fitted to each warrior. Battles were, as a rule, small in scale and often devolved into duels between renowned champions, watched by crowds of spectators as if at a sporting event. Imagine something like rugby, but with much more frequent and deadly knife thrusts. The war also had a distinctly ritualistic character. Before battle, warriors delivered long speeches, sometimes addressing their enemies directly, boasting of their noble lineage, their outstanding feats, and undeniable divine patronage. After the skirmish concluded, they stripped the fallen of their armor and weapons, which were not only valuable trophies but also possessed deep symbolic meaning. And yet, amidst all these stylized duels and grandiose epic speeches, there was also genuine, inexpressible loss. Entire cities were reduced to ruins, sons never returned home, and women endured the horrors of enslavement. The songs of ages remember the names and deeds of heroes, but silence belongs to the countless nameless dead. The monumental work, the Iliad, narrating only a few weeks of the 10th year of the war, opens a window into this critical moment of stalemate and profound grief. It is during this period that we become acquainted with the entire diversity of characters, whose destinies intertwine in the great conflict. Here are Ajax the Great, holding his enormous shield like an impregnable moving wall, and Diomedes, possessing such fury and strength that he was able to wound even Ares himself in the heat of battle, and Nestor, the wisest elder and statesman, whose advice was so verbose and lengthy that it probably sometimes outlasted the battles themselves, and, of course, the gods. Oh yes, the gods. They were by no means neutral observers in this grand confrontation. They openly took sides, engaged in furious quarrels, wove intrigues, and sometimes even personally joined the skirmishes on the battlefield. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon invariably favoured the Greeks, while Apollo, Aphrodite, and Ares firmly stood with the Trojans. Zeus, who nominally was supposed to remain neutral, mostly attempted to maintain order, but failed spectacularly in this endeavour. The gods quarrelled no less passionately than mortals. One could even argue that their disputes were even grander and more dramatic. They threw veritable divine tantrums, shamelessly manipulated human fates, and sometimes, disguised as ordinary soldiers, intervened in the course of events on the battlefield. Truly, the Olympians were history's first and, arguably, most powerful micromanagers. Meanwhile, on the lands beneath Troy's walls, the war raged on. The Greeks, in despair over Achilles' absence from their ranks, decided to resort to a diplomatic solution. They sent a solemn embassy to his tent, hoping to persuade the great warrior to return. This delegation included Odysseus, Phoenix, and Ajax, who arrived with generous offers, untold treasures, sincere apologies, and even the return of Briseis. However, Achilles, grimly seated in his tent, categorically refused all offers, and his refusal was dictated not by a momentary whim, but by a deep principle. His honour had been trampled, and in the world of heroic warriors of that era, honour was considered far more vital than any armour. To be publicly disgraced meant not merely to inflict an insult, It was tantamount to destroying the very soul of the warrior. Nevertheless, even Achilles, despite his stubborn seclusion, could not completely ignore the dramatic events unfolding on the battlefield. Hector, displaying unprecedented courage and commanding will, led a powerful Trojan offensive. He drove the Greeks back to their very ships, and soon threatening fires began to spread through the camp. For a moment it seemed that Troy might prevail, not through cunning or overwhelming force, but through sheer, relentless persistence. This was the moment when the war began to turn inward, becoming a test of spirit. A moment when the greatest heroes on both sides stood on the very brink of the abyss, not yet clashing in the decisive battle, but already fully revealed in their power and vulnerability. And for now, the Greeks fortified their positions, entrenched along the shore. The Trojans continued their assault, and Helen watched all that unfolded from the city walls. Her own fate, and the fates of all others not yet definitively written. The siege, in essence, was only beginning. The walls of Troy still stood impregnable, but something far deeper began to crumble. Trust, pride, and the thin threads connecting kings to kings. And so the 10th year of the war arrived. Achilles remained silent, Agamemnon was humiliated, and Hector rose, his glory growing. In our next chapter, these cracks will deepen even further. The war, which until now had only smouldered beneath the surface, will begin to boil with new, furious intensity. For now, let the warriors rest peacefully. The ships are still anchored, the fires still smoulder, and the gods have not yet cast their final, decisive lots. When people envision the Trojan War, they often picture continuous roars of battle, gleaming blades, furiously shouting heroes, and gods hurling lightning from the heavens. However, the truth, if such a thing can even exist in the realm of mythology, turns out to be somewhat less cinematic and significantly slower, more drawn out. For over 9 long years, yes, 9, this war unfolded in such a bleak, grueling manner that it could test the patience of even the most ardent and enthusiastic poet. It was a siege whose essence lay not in incessant battles, but in slow attrition, constant raids, hunger, disease, and of course the occasional but destructive divine tantrum. And perhaps it is for this reason that the Trojan War retains its relevance and lives on through the ages. Not simply because of the final decisive blow, the famous horse, the all-consuming fire, or the ultimate fall of the city, but because it reflects something deeply human. A grand idea that, once set in motion, becomes unstoppable by anyone. A war initially begun for honor, but which gradually transforms into anything but. Let's return to the shores where the main events unfolded. The Greeks established their sprawling camp along the coastline, which stretched out like a market left too long under the scorching sun. Their mighty ships were dragged ashore and carefully reinforced behind an impressive wall of stakes and deep trenches. The warriors were equipped for a short, swift war, which naturally meant they were utterly unprepared for a prolonged conflict. Troy's mighty walls stood impregnable, firm and secure, and the Trojans rarely dared to venture beyond them. Every attempt to storm the city resulted in bloodshed and deep disappointment for the attackers. And so, for most of those 9 years, the Greeks did everything in their power to achieve their goal. They conducted numerous raids on the surrounding lands, mercilessly plundering cities. Loyal to Troy, seizing provisions, livestock, gold, and, most tragically, women. These women were cruelly taken as concubines, slaves becoming a kind of currency in the games of war. War, for all its heroic poetry, also possessed a cruel, transactional nature. This is how Briseis and Chryseis entered history. Two women who were swept up by the relentless wave of war, given to men as prizes, and ultimately served to ignite the very quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, which we have already mentioned. However, the cracks in the Greek coalition ran far deeper than this single disagreement. Beneath the veneer of polished speeches and gleaming bronze breastplates, the Greek alliance began to slowly but surely unravel. Agamemnon's leadership, though militarily justified and recognized, was deeply unpopular among the other kings. He possessed a peculiar talent for taking significantly more than his fair share of the spoils, while offering significantly less than the deserved share of praise. Kings like Odysseus, Diomedes, and Ajax often found themselves having to balance the necessity of obedience, their own ambitions, and ever-growing irritation. Achilles, for his part, completely withdrew from the war. His pride was deeply wounded, and his honor offended to the very core. He categorically refused to fight. For much of these protracted years he spent his time in his tent, monotonously sharpening weapons, drawing melancholic sounds from his lyre, and generally embodying the sullen symbol of Bronze Age masculinity. Meanwhile, the Trojans were by no means idle. While the Greeks devastated the surrounding lands, the Trojans actively forged new alliances. Reinforcements arrived from neighboring kingdoms. Lycians, Phrygians, and other peoples whose names unfortunately are lost in the Emyn mists of time. Among these newly arrived warriors, Sarpedon, son of Zeus himself, stood out, who fought with a calm and unwavering dignity that later inspired even his enemies. Inside Troy itself, tension mounted. The inhabitants suffered, food became increasingly scarce, and supplies from the interior were reliably cut off by Greek patrols. And yet, against all odds, the city walls held, remaining a symbol of unyielding resilience in the face of overwhelming forces. As the war dragged on, both sides increasingly relied on divine patronage, or at least its illusion. The Greeks offered abundant sacrifices to Athena, Hera, and Poseidon. The Trojans, in turn, appealed to Apollo, Aphrodite, and Artemis. The gods, it should be noted, behaved much like mortals. They quarrelled, sulked, played favourites, and sometimes, disguised, burst directly onto the battlefield. There is a story, whispered by later poets, of a duel between Menelaus and Paris, which took place at the very beginning of the war. The idea was exceedingly simple: to decide the outcome of the conflict in a one-on-one fight. One duel, one final result. Fewer funerals. The duel was carefully arranged. Menelaus, quite understandably, infuriated to the core, fought with a ferocity born of righteous anger. Paris, less heroic and more concerned with his appearance, was quickly overwhelmed by his opponent's onslaught. As Menelaus prepared to deliver the fatal blow, Aphrodite intervened, miraculously snatching Paris from the battlefield and transporting him back to his chambers to Helen, who by this point was quite fed up with it all. It is worth noting that Aphrodite did not ask anyone for permission. She simply decided, rather like an indulgent parent, that her beloved son had suffered enough. Menelaus, meanwhile, stood in the dust, sword held high, wondering what on earth had just happened. The war, it turned out, would not be decided by honour. In the course of the protracted and bloody events of the Trojan War, There were, of course, moments of genuine triumph that illuminated this harsh period. Among the outstanding personalities of that time, Diomedes, the mighty king of Argos, shone particularly brightly, whose combat prowess and impeccable skill in battle were so striking that they did not go unnoticed even by the inhabitants of Olympus. And so one day, thanks to the divine patronage of Athena, who endowed him with a temporary ability to distinguish the gods amidst the chaos of battle, Diomedes dared to wound Aphrodite herself, the goddess of love and beauty. Imagine, a mortal warrior dared to pierce the tender flesh of an immortal goddess with his bronze. Truly, for her, it was an episode full of humiliation and disgrace. Bloody and screaming hysterically, she rushed to Olympus, where Zeus, the lord of the gods, with paternal gentleness but unequivocally, hinted to her that the battlefield was hardly a suitable place for one whose main weapons were the charms of love and seduction. Subsequently, the same Diomedes managed to wound Ares, the god of war himself, the embodiment of fury and destruction. Ares, in his characteristic manner, did something that instills fear in any warrior. He complained to his almighty father. Zeus, utterly unimpressed by his son's complaint, sternly ordered him to stop dramatizing and return to his duties. These, at first glance, amusing and incredible episodes tell us about much deeper processes. The military conflict, stretched over many years and becoming incredibly convoluted, led to the blurring and then complete merging of the boundaries between the world of gods and the world of mortals. Divine entities ceased to be merely detached, silent observers. They took the most direct part in the maelstrom of events displaying human emotions, sulking, intriguing, and even bleeding divine ichor. And despite the fact that great heroes fell in battle, and majestic cities turned to ashes, the war stubbornly refused to end. Like an uninvited guest, it dragged on, exceeding all conceivable limits. In the Achaean camp, the great Achilles still remained aloof from the bloody clashes, and his decision resulted in increasingly tangible and tragic losses for the Greeks. The absence of their greatest warrior inexorably undermined the morale of the army. At the same time, the valiant Hector, leader of the Trojans, launched increasingly daring and successful offensive actions. The Greek ranks thinned and the number of fallen steadily increased. Even the cunning Odysseus found it increasingly difficult to maintain discipline and concentration in the ranks of the army, although he made every effort to do so, resorting alternately to skillful diplomacy, to exhortations, and sometimes to more earthly means, such as wine. It was in this atmosphere of general despondency and growing mutual distrust that the sinister seed of betrayal took root. The reader probably remembers Palamedes, the wise and perceptive man who, at the very beginning of the war, managed to expose Odysseus's feigned madness. Well, Odysseus, known for his ability to think ahead and not forgive grievances, never forgot that incident. According to later traditions, Odysseus himself masterfully orchestrated Palamedes' accusation of treason, fabricating a compromising letter and planting gold to create a false impression of him receiving bribes from the Trojans. The Greeks, perhaps too desperate and eager to find a culprit for their misfortunes, executed him without further ado. The disappearance of one of the most outstanding minds of the Achaean army became a vivid illustration of the true, genuine cost of war. It took not only the lives of warriors, but also trust between them. It not only destroyed majestic cities, but also undermined virtue itself. The longer this conflict dragged on, the more it demanded, taking not only heroes but also their humanity, their moral principles. And the Achaeans, once united by a noble oath, plunged deeper and deeper into discord and disunity. Agamemnon's arrogant haughtiness caused increasing irritation. Achilles' oppressive silence weighed on everyone. Even Nestor's endless tales, once perceived as wisdom, now seemed merely meaningless noise. And what about Helen? Beautiful Helen still gazed at the unfolding events from the walls of besieged Troy. Her beauty, as if untouched by the destructive influence of time, had turned into a symbol, a living banner of this protracted confrontation. For the Greeks, she embodied stolen treasure, the object of their revenge. For the Trojans, she was what they stubbornly refused to surrender, a symbol of their honor and resilience. Helen herself was a captive between myth and bitter reality, between love and all-consuming hatred, between past and present. In Homer's immortal Iliad, she expresses deep regret, calling herself a dog, an epithet full of shame, and asking if she is forever cursed. It is quite possible that she, more than anyone else, saw the true face of this war, not as a heroic saga of glory, but as a slowly unfolding, all-encompassing tragedy. Thus concluded the 9th agonizing year of the Trojan War. The Achaeans, exhausted by endless battles and torn by internal contradictions, still clung firmly to their coastal foothold. The Trojans, battered and worn down by the siege but still isolated within the walls of their stronghold, continued to heroically defend the city. The gods of Olympus, licking their wounds, both literal received in clashes and those inflicted on their pride, still intervened in the course of events, guided solely by their own whims. And the great Achilles still remained in his tent, immersed in silent but furious resentment, refusing to yield, neither to the imperious Agamemnon, nor to the merciless war, nor even to fate itself. However, in this seemingly frozen situation, changes were brewing. For in the very heart of the Greek camp, amidst the flickering campfires, a young warrior named Patroclus watched the world intently. And very soon, this fire, a harbinger of coming upheavals, was to ignite with new force and engulf everything around. If war itself could have a heartbeat, it would manifest not in the clash of bronze shields or the clang of chariot wheels. Rather, it would be the bated breath between cause and effect, the ominous silence preceding truly dreadful events. It is now that we approach the very essence, the beating heart of the great Iliad. This is not about the genesis of the Trojan War, nor its conclusion, but about a unique, fateful stretch of days in the 10th year of the conflict, when the immense pride of a single man would forever alter the course of history. The name of this man, of course, is Achilles, born of the mortal king Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, who, it was said, held the threads of his destiny in her hands. Achilles grew up aware of his exceptionality and the predestination of his fate. Legends claimed that two paths lay before him, a long life, devoid of heroic glory, or a short but brilliant path that would echo through the ages. He unhesitatingly chose the latter. However, few warn that glory itself rarely feels grand in the moment of its experience. Often it appears solitary, causes irritation, and is surrounded by people who cannot comprehend its true value. At this stage of the narrative, the great Achilles demonstratively refused to participate in combat. His conflict with Agamemnon, which erupted over the captive Briseis, plunged the hero into such deep and legendary resentment that it entirely occupies the first book of Homer's immortal Iliad. However, to call this feeling mere resentment would be to miss its entire dramatic depth and scope. Achilles was not simply displaying a sulky mood or childish petulance. He had been subjected to public and cruel humiliation. In a warrior society where honor was valued equally with life itself, Agamemnon dared to take both from him. The fact was that when Agamemnon was forced to return Chryseis to stop the plague sent by Apollo, he, as compensation, decided to take Briseis from Achilles, as if exchanging captives could serve as a tool to maintain morale. By this act, he grossly violated the unwritten but sacred code of honor that existed among the Achaean heroes. A man's spoils, however acquired, were an integral part of his dignity and glory. In essence, Agamemnon might as well have taken Achilles' shield and publicly desecrated it by spitting on it. Surprisingly, Achilles responded not with an outburst of violence, but with complete withdrawal. He secluded himself in his tent, categorically refusing to fight or even speak to Agamemnon. And while he indulged in angry contemplation, outside his tent, on the battlefields, the course of the war began to change rapidly. Without Achilles' presence on the battlefield, the Trojans, sensing the enemy's weakness, surged forward with renewed energy. Hector, noble in character and unsurpassed in the performance of his warrior's duty, led one attack after another, giving the Greeks no respite. The Achaeans, caught between the hammer of ineffective command and the anvil of active divine intervention, began to rapidly lose ground. Isolated skirmishes soon turned into a panicked retreat. Even the invincible Ajax, one of the mightiest Greek warriors, was forced to withdraw under the enemy's onslaught. At one critical moment, the Trojans broke through to the Greek ships themselves, to the very beachhead that the Achaeans had heroically held for nearly a decade. Achilles, meanwhile, watched these developments from his tent, but remained absolutely inactive. This, perhaps, is one of the most striking and significant features of the Iliad. The defining act of its greatest hero is precisely inaction. For many pages of the epic he remains aloof, nursing his deep resentment, not from a lack of courage but from a principled refusal to give Agamemnon the satisfaction that his return to the battlefield would bring. One can interpret this as a harsh lesson on how dangerous pride mixed with unshakable principles can become, or perhaps how easily divine intervention can cast down and destroy the best of mortals. Meanwhile, Agamemnon, quite uncharacteristically for his usually arrogant nature, began to panic. Belatedly realizing the catastrophic consequences of alienating his greatest warrior, he hastened to offer an unheard-of ransom. Untold treasures, magnificent horses, entire cities, and even the return of Briseis, swearing that she remained untouched, as if Achilles should now be grateful to him for it. He even swore a solemn oath, which was extremely rare for Agamemnon, who usually swore only to himself, looking in a mirror. The embassy sent to convey these belated apologies included the most influential and persuasive Greek heroes: Odysseus, whose eloquence was legendary; Ajax, whose strength inspired awe; and Phoenix, Achilles' old mentor, sent in the hope that paternal affection could succeed where political stratagems had failed. And so, finally, they entered Achilles' tent. There they found the great hero, quietly strumming a lyre, not preparing for battle but immersed in the world of music. This was, perhaps, a silent reminder that even the greatest warriors possess a rich inner life. far removed from the brutality of war. They presented their arguments, appealing to glory, honor, and the pressing needs of all Greece. But Achilles responded with a categorical no, uttered not with furious rage, but with unshakable, quiet conviction. He reasoned about the futility of this protracted conflict, about the insults inflicted by Agamemnon, about how no amount of gold could atone for lost honor and pride. He even questioned the heroic code itself, asking, why should he die for a man who treats him with contempt? What is the price of victory if to achieve it one must lose oneself? And so he refused. The embassy returned empty-handed, and the war, deprived of its last hope for reconciliation, became even bloodier and more merciless. When the Greek camp was on the verge of complete annihilation, and the audacity of the Trojans reached its peak, Patroclus stepped forward. Ah, yes, Patroclus, the loyal friend, reliable companion, blood brother. And some sources even hint at something more than mere friendship. In the Homeric world, however, the exact nature of their relationship is secondary to their deep emotional bond and significance. Patroclus was to Achilles like his own heart, beating outside his body, and he could no longer idly watch the Greeks perish. He pleaded with Achilles in desperation, "Let me take your place in battle. Let me put on your armor. Let the Trojans see it. And believe you have returned. Perhaps that will make them retreat." Achilles, after much deliberation, agreed, but set one immutable condition. "Only drive them from our ships. Do not pursue them to the very gates of Troy." Patroclus donned the shining armor, forged by the gods themselves, which was unmistakably recognizable as Achilles' attire, and led a detachment of Myrmidons into battle. The calculation proved correct. The Trojans, convinced of Achilles' return, were seized with panic and began to retreat in disarray. Patroclus fought with incredible skill, with a fury bordering on madness, and more than a little recklessness. He struck down one warrior after another, including Sarpedon, son of Zeus himself, causing grief of such intensity that even the gods of Olympus began to argue about the need for intervention. However, Patroclus, caught up in the whirlwind of battle and his own triumph, forgot his promise. He pursued the Trojans to the very walls of their impregnable fortress. It was there that Hector awaited him. They clashed in a deadly struggle, spear against sword, Trojan prince against great hero. In the end, Hector dealt Patroclus a mortal blow, not realizing the true identity of his opponent until Patroclus's helmet fell from his head. The news of Patroclus's death shocked not only Achilles, but all the Greeks, the Trojans, and even the gods. However, no one felt this loss as deeply as Achilles. Upon learning what had happened, he collapsed to the ground, overcome with furious grief. He wept, tore at his hair, covered himself in ashes, and rolled in the dust. His pride, his stubborn refusal to fight, his all-consuming rage, all of this first turned inward, tormenting his soul. And then, like a volcanic eruption, it burst forth. Thus began the legendary wrath of Achilles. It would be beautiful in its power. It would be terrible in its destructiveness. And it could no longer be stopped. First, the great Achilles, whose might was undeniable, set about finding new armor. His previous set of armor, so recognizable and awe-inspiring, now lay upon the body of fallen Patroclus. In response to this urgent need, Thetis, his immortal mother, majestically rose from the depths of the sea and went directly to Hephaestus, the divine smith, whose hands wrought wonders. It was he, the skilled craftsman of Olympus, who forged an entirely new set of armor for Achilles. The bronze from which it was made radiated such dazzling brilliance that it seemed to live with its own light. The shield, the central element of this divine equipment, was so magnificent that an entire universe was contained on its surface, depicting the cosmos in all its splendor. This was not merely protective gear, it was fate itself, clad in material form, ready to descend upon the battlefield. After donning this magnificent armor, Achilles once again stepped into the arena of battle. The Greek warriors, seeing his return, filled the battlefield with a triumphant roar, imbued with renewed hope. The Trojans, on the other hand, at the sight of the fearsome hero, seized with panicked terror, felt the approach of inevitable doom. The gods of Olympus, observing from above, were divided in their feelings. Some gazed upon Achilles with reverent awe, others with genuine horror, for they understood perfectly. When rage consumed Achilles, he ceased to be a mere mortal. He transformed into an unstoppable storm, sweeping everything in its path. He cut through the dense ranks of Trojan defenders with the same ease and destructive force with which fire consumes dry straw. His battle was driven not by a thirst for glory or a desire to please Agamemnon, but by deep, all-consuming grief for Patroclus. He relentlessly drove the Trojans back to the city walls, mercilessly destroying everyone who dared to stand in his way. His fury reached such a peak that he clashed with the river god Scamander himself, who, enraged by the mountains of corpses choking his sacred waters, attempted to drown the hero. Even the immortal gods had to intervene to rescue Achilles from the raging torrent. And finally, the inevitable moment arrived when he confronted Hector. The details of this fateful duel will be recounted in the next chapter, for it demands separate, close attention. But for now, let us return to Achilles' tent, where grim silence and deep despondency had recently reigned. Now furious, frantic stomping was heard. His hands, once still in inactivity, now burned with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. His heart, once filled with pride, blazed with the fire of unbearable grief. Achilles' wrath was much deeper than mere military fury. It stemmed from the unbearable weight of loss, from the powerlessness of watching a loved one die, and the agonizing realization of his own indirect guilt in what had happened. He had left the battle to assert his right, but now that right caused him unbearable, scorching pain. Achilles returned to war, but this was no longer a campaign for honor or pride. It was, in essence, a moving funeral, a procession of grief, carving its way through blood and chaos. In the annals of mythology, there are exceptional moments when the din of war subsides, when the clang of spears, the thud of hooves, and the shouts of the crowd dissipate into the air, leaving behind only an all-encompassing silence. And in this ensuing stillness, something primal and deeply human awakens. Grief. The present episode is precisely such a moment. Although the battle continued to rage with undiminished fury, Greeks still perished on the field, and Trojans desperately defended their city. All of this, for the briefest time, became merely a backdrop for the immeasurable sorrow of one man. Achilles had just lost his dear Patroclus. For many, Patroclus appeared to be merely a companion, a trusted deputy, a loyal friend. However, for Achilles, his significance was immeasurably greater. He was a connecting link, the embodiment of conscience, a constant reminder that existence extends beyond blood and bronze. Their bond was exceptionally deep, forged not only in the fires of war, but also in shared laughter, common memories, and those quiet hours when no one could observe them. Some traditions claim they were lovers, while others call them brothers in spirit. But on one point ancient texts agree, and Homer unequivocally sings of it. Achilles loved Patroclus more than anyone else in the entire world, and when that love was cruelly snatched from him, everything that had previously held Achilles together as an individual collapsed with it. Let us turn to the moment of his death. Patroclus, clad in Achilles' armor, led the Myrmidons into battle, successfully driving the Trojans back from the Greek ships. For a brief moment, this audacious plan worked flawlessly. The Trojans, misled, believed that the great Achilles had returned, and panic, like a wave, swept through their ranks. However, Patroclus, exhilarated by his sudden success, forgot the strict warning Achilles had given him. Do not go to the gates. He rushed there anyway, and there, beneath the high, impregnable walls of Troy, he was struck down. First, he was wounded by Euphorbus, then the hand of fate itself intervened, and finally, Hector, the valiant prince of Troy, delivered the fatal blow. Hector stripped the famous armor from Patroclus's lifeless body, not yet knowing the true identity of the fallen warrior, and triumphantly proclaimed his victory. But then, dying on the ground, Patroclus, gathering his last strength, spoke. He foretold to Hector that Achilles would surely come, that his death would not end this war, but only begin it. And so it came to pass. In the Greek camp, far from the bloody chaos of battle, Achilles still remained in his tent, withdrawn from the world, filled with bitterness and stubbornly refusing to take up arms again. And then, in this grim hour, came news that shook him to his very core. Traditions diverge as to who exactly brought this tragic news. In some stories it was Antilochus, son of Nestor, whose words were broken by sobs and choked with unbearable grief. In others, a chorus of surviving warriors, their faces distorted by horror and sorrow. But the result was unchanged. Achilles collapsed as if struck down. He fell to the ground, scattered dust over his head, an ancient sign of the deepest despair, and let out a cry. It was not merely a human wail. It was the cry of a man wounded not in flesh, but in his very soul. A cry capable of shaking not only the tents of mortals, but the immortal gods themselves. In response to this frantic call, his mother, the goddess Thetis, rose from the depths of the sea. She, like all gods, knew what had happened even before he uttered a word. And then Achilles, with pain in his voice, told her of his decision. I must return to war. I must kill Hector. I must avenge Patroclus, even if it means my own inevitable death. For at this moment Achilles understood something terrible and inescapable. His fate was finally sealed, the choice that had once been offered to him, between a long, peaceful life without glory or a short but glorious one, had now vanished. Patroclus was dead, and for Achilles there remained only one path, a single road leading to vengeance. However, he could not embark on it immediately. First, following ancient customs and the dictates of his heart, he had to honorably bury his friend. The Greek warriors, faced with fierce resistance, managed with great difficulty to retrieve Patroclus's body from the battlefield. Hector and his Trojan forces, eager for both valuable armor and glory, tried to reclaim it. However, the valiant Ajax and Menelaus, along with other heroes, courageously repelled all their attacks, preventing the desecration of the fallen. At this critical moment, Achilles himself appeared on the battlefield, though unarmed, and let out such a thunderous roar that the Trojans recoiled in terror. His mere presence, his furious emergence, instantly changed the course of the battle, striking fear into the hearts of the enemy. Soon after, Thetis, the hero's ever-beautiful mother, once again went to Hephaestus, the divine smith. There in the forge, engulfed in divine flames, new armor was forged, surpassing the previous in its brilliance, strength, and inspiring even greater terror. The central element of this magnificent set was a shield, so skillfully crafted that the entire world was contained upon it. Cities at peace and in war, farmers toiling in the fields, lovers dancing in joy, and stars majestically revolving overhead. This work of art served as a reminder, even to Achilles, that there was something far greater in life than mere revenge. However, he unhesitatingly donned them. Then followed the funeral rites. In Homeric culture, these ceremonies were considered sacred, for to die without proper burial meant to wander eternally in the underworld in misery. Achilles vowed not only to bury, but to honor Patroclus with all possible reverence. A huge and solemn funeral pyre was erected. Sacrifices were made, among which stood out the terrible 12 Trojan captives, whom Achilles coldly killed in Patroclus's name. It is hard to say whether this was an act of profound grief or unrestrained rage, but it was a grim and deeply telling act. Funeral games were also held, chariot races, boxing matches, javelin throwing. These were not merely entertainments, but rather acts of remembrance, intended to honor the spirit of the deceased. For the Greeks, excellence in sport was a way of connecting with the divine. Thus, even in death, Patroclus was surrounded by the greatest honors. Then came the poignant moment when Achilles, in a small but devastating gesture, placed a lock of his own hair in Patroclus's hand. He whispered his vows, and the pyre was lit. Smoke curled skyward, rising like the soul of the departed, and somewhere in that long twilight between myth and living memory, Patroclus passed forever into legend. But Achilles found no peace. He found only an even stronger, unquenchable rage. His gaze, full of indomitable fury, was now fixed on the impregnable walls of Troy and its valiant defender Hector. It must be acknowledged that Hector killed Patroclus not out of personal malice or cruelty. He was merely defending his city, and at that moment he had no idea who was inside the famous armor. However, such subtleties and nuances do not survive in the face of all-consuming grief. And so Achilles returned to the battlefield once more. He moved across the field of battle like an unquenchable flame, sweeping everything in his path. He killed without stopping, his rage knowing no bounds. He hunted the Trojans like a predator hunts its prey, mercilessly and relentlessly. He even defied the gods themselves, clashing with Xanthos, the mighty river god of Troy, who pleaded with him to stop choking his sacred waters with the corpses of the fallen. Achilles refused, and when the river rose in anger, attempting to engulf him in its turbulent waters, it took the intervention of Hera, Athena, and Hephaestus, who used fire against the flood, to rescue the hero. Even the immortal inhabitants of Olympus could barely contain his furious strength. And then, finally, the moment of their meeting arrived. Hector and Achilles faced each other. This was not just a random clash on a bloody field, not a fleeting skirmish. It was a predicted, long-awaited, and deeply personal duel. Hector waited outside the city gates, perfectly aware that this hour was inevitable. He stood there not only as Troy's defender, but as the embodiment of every man who fights not by his own desire, but by the call of duty. As Achilles approached, Hector's courage faltered. He ran. 3 times they circled Troy's high walls, Achilles pursuing, Hector fleeing, until at last Athena, disguised as Hector's brother, deceived him into stopping. The 2 great warriors stood facing each other, and the fight was swift. Achilles struck Hector, piercing him in the neck with his spear. But death alone was not enough to quench his burning thirst for vengeance. In one of the most brutal and heartbreaking episodes of Homeric poetry, Achilles, unsated by his enemy's death, tied Hector's body by the ankles to his chariot and dragged it through the dusty ground around the walls of Troy. This spectacle unfolded before the eyes of Hector's weeping parents, his grieving wife, and even Helen, who had once called him gentle and kind. This act of desecration was not merely an act of cruelty. It represented a blatant violation of everything sacred in Greek belief. Burial was not a privilege, it was an inherent right for everyone, even an enemy. However, Achilles, blinded by his uncontrolled grief, transgressed this ancient code. And yet we do not turn away from him in condemnation. For Achilles is not a monster. He is a man tormented by unbearable pain. He lost the only person who understood him to his core, the one who served as his anchor, and without Patroclus, Achilles became uncontrollable. His code of honor, so carefully observed before, collapsed under the crushing weight of loss. For 12 days he continued to drag Hector's body in circles, each day bringing new dust and each night new disgrace. And yet the body, miraculously preserved by Apollo, did not succumb to decay. It seemed even the gods did not wish for this tragic story to prematurely end in oblivion. The watching gods grew increasingly restless. Even Apollo, who traditionally favored the Trojans, called for mercy. And finally, Zeus, the supreme god of Olympus himself, sent word that sounded like a final judgment. Enough. And so begins the final, culminating act of this great tragedy. Priam, the aged king of Troy, father of 50 sons, now stripped of everything but his bitter memories, dares to penetrate the Greek camp. He comes not with an army, but with a ransom and with a last, desperate hope. Alone, he enters Achilles' tent, falls to his knees and speaks in a voice ravaged by years and grief. I kiss the hands that killed my son. And in this poignant moment, something inside Achilles breaks. Achilles looks at Priam and sees in him a reflection of Peleus, his own aging father. He sees his own inevitable end. He comprehends a world built not on victories and vengeance, but on an endless cycle of grief passed from one person to another. He weeps. He raises Priam from the ground, offers him food, shelter, and even comfort. In the silence that hangs between them, something sacred is felt. They eat. They speak of fathers and sons, of what no poem can fully convey. And then, without ceremony, without further bargaining, he returns Hector's body. Two men sit not as sworn enemies but as fathers who have lost their sons. For a brief moment the war pauses. There are no trumpet blasts, no warlike declarations, only a deep, all-encompassing silence. Hector is buried. A magnificent funeral pyre was built. His wife Andromache grieves. His mother Hecuba weeps. Even Helen speaks words of farewell, calling him the only man in Troy who never shamed her. This serves as a reminder that even in war, kindness speaks louder than conquest. And so Troy's defender passes forever into the memory of generations. And what of Achilles? He now knows that his own death is approaching, but for the first time this knowledge no longer holds its former meaning for him. He has done what needed to be done, not in battle but in an act of mercy, and this is his true transformation. Achilles began his journey as the embodiment of rage, of unrestrained pride, and here, for just a breath of history, he becomes something else. Not just a warrior, not a son of prophecy, but a man who has deeply felt sorrow and chosen compassion. The tide of war has changed, not because the Greeks achieved victory, but because their greatest hero showed that war does not always end in triumph. Sometimes it is simply survival, sometimes it means letting go. Troy still stands, but its walls now seem thinner, less secure. The gods no longer shout, and Achilles, our brightest, shortest flame, stands on the very edge of his destiny. The next arrow has already left the bow. By this point, the ancient sands beneath Troy seemed forever saturated with crimson blood, yet the mighty city still held strong. In this unending epic, heroes appeared on stage and vanished like shadows. The gods of Olympus, sometimes taking sides, sometimes suddenly changing their minds, at times even descended to earth themselves to participate in the brutal battles. The greatest warrior whom Hellas had ever known returned to the battlefield to avenge his loyal friend, and for a brief moment found a semblance of peace, but it was merely a deceptive mirage. The end, that distant but inexorable thunder of fate, sounded louder and more insistent. And now the war, it seemed, was preparing for its final, decisive turn. Achilles, that terrifying warrior in his fury, still stood on the field, still alive, but his time was inexorably drawing to a close. It is time to speak of his death. Not because it was unexpected, on the contrary, in the spirit of Greek myth, it proved terrifyingly predictable. The Olympian Mahir, and especially Apollo, had by no means forgotten what Achilles had done to Hector's body. Apollo watched with undisguised disgust as the body was dragged through the dust, as the sacred burial code was disregarded, as a mortal's rage crossed all conceivable bounds. That is why, when the time for reckoning came, he lent his aid to the most improbable figure, Paris. Paris was not a hero in the usual sense. He was rather a lover, a charming man, a prince with noble features but with extremely poor judgment. However, under Apollo's guidance, he took up his bow, and as Achilles, radiant with victory, approached too close to the Scaean gates, Paris loosed an arrow. Some traditions say the arrow struck him in the heel, the only vulnerable spot that Thetis could not protect when she dipped him in the waters of the Styx. Others claim it was the invisible hand of a god that made the arrow deadly. In any case, the result was the same. Achilles fell. There were no grand farewell speeches, no slowed-down moments of a last breath, just the simple fall of a man who had burned too brightly for too long. The Greeks, overcome with grief, then, quite predictably, began to argue over who would inherit Achilles' armor. These were the finest armors in the world, forged by Hephaestus himself, gleaming with divine artistry. Two men stepped forward to claim them: Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, mighty, straightforward, and fiercely loyal, and Odysseus, son of Laertes, cunning as a god, and twice as persuasive. A contest was arranged. The Greeks listened intently to the speeches. Ajax spoke of his glorious deeds and exploits. Odysseus, however, emphasized strategy and cunning, and in the end, the armor went to the man who could turn words into deadly weapons: Odysseus. Ajax was crushed by this decision. He had fought bravely, carried Achilles' body from the battlefield, stood firm when others faltered, and now he was passed over in favor of an eloquent tactician. His honor, so long tied to his immense strength, crumbled to dust. In the utter darkness of night, Ajax lost his mind. He slaughtered sheep, mistaking them for his enemies. When his sanity returned, and he realized what he had done, he took his own life with his own sword, utterly alone. Thus perished another hero, not in the heat of battle, but from agonizing despair. The Greeks quietly burned his body. Even then, suicide remained a complex and controversial issue. Honor and shame were forever intertwined in this tragedy. And Troy, despite all these losses, still stood unyielding. By this point, the war had completely transformed into a tragic theatre of the absurd. Each hero fell in turn, like an actor on a stage. The gods began to gradually withdraw, perhaps ashamed of what they themselves had helped create. The Greeks, in despair, turned to prophecies. This was always the last resort when all other means proved powerless. According to the seers' predictions, 3 crucial conditions had to be met for Troy to fall. First, Achilles' son had to fight beneath Troy's walls. Second, the Greeks had to retrieve Heracles' bow. Third, the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena, had to be removed from Troy. Simple, isn't it? So they set off to find Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, also known as Pyrrhus. Raised far from the horrors of war, he was young, inexperienced, and full of that aggressive self-confidence only adolescents possess. When Odysseus found him, the youth agreed to join them, not out of duty but by the call of fate. He was to finish what his father had started. Then came Philoctetes. Philoctetes was a sore point for the Greeks. Years earlier he had been bitten by a snake on the way to Troy, and the wound festered, emitting a foul odour. The Greeks, never known for their particular sensitivity, abandoned him on the island of Lemnos. With him they left Heracles' bow, the only weapon foretold to bring down Troy. Charmingly, Odysseus returned to him, full of apologies. Philoctetes was, quite understandably, furious. But after some persuasion and the promise of heroic redemption, he agreed. The bow returned to the war. The prophecy began to unfold piece by piece. The third task involved cunning, The Palladium, a statue of Athena, protected Troy. As long as it stood, the city could not fall. Odysseus and Diomedes crept into Troy at night, climbed over the walls, and stole it. No flashes of lightning, no glint of armor, just two men doing what entire armies could not. And now, finally, Troy was vulnerable. But it was still not defeated. And then it was time for the great trick. The Greeks, led by Odysseus, built a wooden horse, a huge, hollow structure, carved to look like an offering to Athena. They left it at Troy's gates and sailed away, or at least so it seemed. The Trojans discovered it, confused, curious, and debating. Some, like Laocoon, warned against it. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he said, before being rather dramatically eaten by sea serpents. The gods evidently were not subtle in their hints. Others, like Sinon, a Greek left behind, feigning desertion, told a story of sacrifice, atonement, the end of the war. The horse, he claimed, would bless Troy, and the Trojans, tired and full of hope, dragged it inside the city walls. This was followed by a long night of celebrations. After 10 years of siege, the Trojans finally had reason to rejoice. Fires were lit, wine flowed, songs were sung, and the people of Troy, weary but joyful, believed the war was over. But war, as wars tend to do, had its final act. At night the Greeks returned. Warriors emerged from the horse. Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and others. They opened the gates. The Greek army, hidden on a nearby island, stormed the city. Chaos was immediate and all-consuming. Temples burned. Families fled in panic. The clang of bronze echoed through the narrow streets. Priam, the old king, was cut down at Zeus's altar by Neoptolemus himself, an act that even in the blood-soaked economy of war was considered monstrous. Hecuba, his queen, was taken captive. Andromache, Hector's widow, saw her child, Astyanax, thrown from the walls. A cold calculation to prevent the revenge of the next generation. Helen was returned to Menelaus, though not without tension. Some say he raised his sword and she simply dropped her clothes. Old habits, apparently, die hard. But what about the victors? They won, yes. But what did they truly win? The city lay in ruins. Troy's treasures were loaded onto ships. The gods, once so actively involved in mortal fates, fell silent. And the Greeks, the few who survived, began the long, uncertain journey home. Odysseus would wander for another 10 years. Agamemnon would return to a wife plotting his murder. Menelaus would roam Egypt before finally returning to Sparta. The war had ended, but the stories had only just begun. Victory in Greek myth is never clean. There is always a price, a stain, a reckoning. And the horse, it remained not as a relic, but as a symbol, an eternal reminder that in the end, Troy was not ruined by strength. It was a story of deception.